Good morning. Greetings from Ithaca, New York. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this Food Tech Expo, although doing so virtually. I've been asked to talk about the role of millets and sorghum in achieving the SDG goals. As all of you know, we've made tremendous progress globally on hunger reduction. Much of that progress has happened due to significant gains in productivity of the big three staple crops, rice, wheat, and maize. We've seen that progress happening in Asia, in Latin America, and to some extent also in sub-Saharan Africa. Despite this progress, we still have hundreds of millions of people that are still hungry, that are still starving. And a large proportion of that population is in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. And many of these populations are desperately hungry and desperately poor. And for them, access to the big three staples is limited. Their food and their staple is millets, all types of millets and sorghum. These are their traditional foods. And we've not seen that productivity increase for these primary staples that are so important to the poor as we have seen for the big staples. This has been an unfortunate situation. It's been unfortunate because many of the millet species and sorghums have much greater levels of micronutrient content, mineral content than rice and wheat. And they're much healthier to consume. And they can address both the problem of calorie hunger and micronutrient malnutrition, and therefore address both hunger as well as the hidden hunger issues for the very poor populations around the developing world, but particularly looking at sub-Saharan Africa. That's been a big benefit from trying to expand the productivity of millets and sorghum so that we can reach these very poor populations for whom this has been a major staple crop. Also, as we look forward, we're beginning to see that undernutrition and micronutrient malnutrition are not just the only problems developing countries face. Many developing countries, including many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, are also facing rising levels of obesity and rising levels of overweight populations. And for these populations, transitioning from a diet that's predominantly rice and wheat based to a diet that includes millets, includes sorghum, can reduce the risk of overweight and obesity. So in my view, investments in sorghum and millets and investments in value chains that enhance the supply of these crops, enhance the supply of these foods at affordable prices to the poor, addresses both the problems of undernutrition and the problems of overnutrition. And that's the benefit that one would see from massive investments in these crops. Historically, we've seen that while productivity growth of the big three staples has increased over time, over the last 5 decades or so, we've not seen a similar experience happening for the minor cereals, for millets, for sorghum, etc. Why is that the case? Well, there's several reasons for it. I think one of the primary reason is that the R&D investments in these minor staples has been limited relative to the major staples. And that's been true across the world. And that's particularly been true when you look at South Asia and you look at Sub-Saharan Africa. Public sector investment in millets, in sorghum, etc., has been extremely limited. And that has led to significant stagnation in overall productivity of these crops. The second big reason, I believe, is private sector investments. Private sector investment in not just in investing in improved varieties, but investing in the value chains that can help enhance the supply of the staples has been limited. And the primary reason for that has been that, that many of the millets and sorghum, the markets for these crops has been very limited. The markets are much more regional, much more geographically specific, and don't have the scale that you see for rice or for wheat or for maize. And because of that, many of the large global multinational agro-food companies have tended to shy away from investments in value chains for these crops and investments in global trade in these crops and building up a global supply chain for these crops. And that's been a major limiting factor. We've not even seen domestic private sector stepping in. We've not seen domestic private sector in Sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia that have stepped in to address this deficiency in value chain investments for these crops. I think the third big reason that I see that has limited the productivity of the minor staples has been that much of the food and agriculture policy in developing countries, particularly in South Asia, but also increasingly in Sub-Saharan Africa, has provided major incentives for shifting diets away from traditional cereals to the big three, rice, wheat, and maize. And this has happened by promoting investments in productivity improvements of the big three staples, by crowding out the areas that traditionally grew millets and sorghum and replacing those areas with rice, wheat, and maize production, by providing price incentives, by providing input subsidies, credit subsidies, etc., for the big three staple crops, and by creating government procurement systems that have created incentives for farmers to produce the big three staples and then provide them to the government procurement systems, which then feed into subsidized food grain value chains, food grain systems, such as the public distribution system in India, etc., for meeting the needs of the poor. So over time, you've seen this transition happening from diets, traditional diets of the poor, towards an increased dependence on the big three staples. And that has then led to a disincentive for many farmers and the supply chain to be investing in millets, in sorghum, etc. And that's the scenario that we've been facing. However, as I look ahead, I see tremendous changes happening. I see tremendous changes happening both from a technology point of view, but also a value chain point of view. But most importantly, I see a big change happening in the demand for millets across the developing world, especially among urban middle-class populations. What we're beginning to see is that as middle-class populations are becoming richer and their diets are diversifying and their consumption of energy intensive and calorie intensive diets has been increasing, we're beginning to see rising problems of overweight and obesity in this population, in the middle classes, urban middle classes across the developing world. And particularly looking at the populations in Asia, South Asia, one sees that there's increased awareness of trying to reduce this risk of overweight and obesity through changing diets. And changing diets through diversification out of a predominantly rice-based diet or a predominantly wheat-based diet towards enhancing the number of food groups consumed. But at the same time, there's been a deliberate shift towards millets as a way, as a substitute for rice and wheat, and a substitute that has lower calories, but has higher levels of micronutrients and minerals. And that change in demand, a health food dimension that we're beginning to see for millets and sorghum is going to create a new drive for the supply of these crops. It's going to create a new opportunities for smallholder agriculture systems in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia to, to, to capture this market, this growing awareness of health, the growing demand for a healthier diet, and the growing demand for millets and sorghum. And that opportunity, I believe, will lead to significant overall income growth for smallholder farmers in these regions. But that would have to come with associated investments in R&D and with investments in value chain development. The investments in enhancing productivity of millets and sorghum would have to come through massive new investments from public sector R&D and also private sector R&D. And today, with some of the advances that are taking place in plant breeding, advances that are taking place in genomics, etc., provide new opportunities for identifying ways in which one can enhance yields and productivity of these minor staples. Opportunities that did not exist during the time of the Green Revolution. But today, one can look at these opportunities and look at opportunities for enhancing the productivity of these crops. It's particularly relevant today, not just from a healthier diet point of view, but also from the point of view of climate resilience, because these crops tend to be more resilient to higher temperatures, more resilient to drought conditions, etc. So you end up with a win-win situation of investing in crops that address hunger and overnutrition issues, but at the same time are more climate resilient, more climate friendly. And that's where much of the R&D investment in the future needs to go. We do need to see this rebalancing of R&D investments that were historically focused on the big three staples to increasingly invest in the minor staples of millets and sorghum. So that's one big part of what we need to do. I think the second area is building up the value chains for these crops and building them up from all the way from farm to the consumer's plate. And at the farm level, value chain investments have to happen, which bring farmers together in farmer producer organizations and farmer cooperatives that then provide the scale that would be feasible, that would be attractive for private sector value chain investors to be able to procure large amounts of grain from small farmers. Small farmers by themselves individually will not be able to access these value chains. But as a group, as a producer group, they will have a scale that will allow them to be able to access these value chains at much lower transactions costs. And also as a group, they'll have the bargaining power to be able to get the price that would be profitable for them. And that would be a major opportunity. And also as a group, they'll be able to access inputs and access credits in a much more cost-effective way than they would as individual small farmers. So that's part of the value chain investment that has to happen. The other part of the value chain investment is looking at the processing industry, looking at ways in which one can bring in millets and sorghum into the food processing sector to create more healthy food. Some of the work that the Smart Food Program is doing, but now looking at ways to scale that up and to make it much more accessible and much more affordable to consumers. Consumers in urban areas, certainly, but also looking at ways in which we can reach poor consumers, especially in remote rural areas. And I think that's going to be a really important key as you think about value chain investments and value chain development. And this is an area where private sector investment has to be crucial, but it's also an area where public support and public-private partnerships could be developed in order to reduce some of the risks that private sector investment faces as they look into growing into this new area of building up these value chains. I think the final point of looking ahead is to look at how one needs to change the overall food and agriculture policies. For a long time now, when we thought about food security, we thought about investments in rice, wheat, and maize. And food policy has been so sharply focused on and increasing the pile of these three staple crops. But what we need to do looking forward is to create a food and agriculture policy that is less distortionary in that sense. A food and agriculture policy that is neutral in terms of promoting a broad set of staple cereals. And maybe for an initial period, taking the emphasis away from the big three staples and being much more proactive in promoting the minor staples. And helping small farms to improved access to credit, improved access to inputs, improved access to technology, reducing their transactions costs and accessing value chains, etc. So that one needs to see a fairly dramatic change in overall policies in food and agriculture in order to make this transition towards healthier grains and addressing both the undernutrition problem, the hunger problem for the poor, but also the overnutrition problem and the rising obesity problem for middle class populations in urban areas. I think the future is enormously bright as we look at these crops. The challenges are great, but we already know how one can enhance overall staple crop productivity and overall staple crop supplies when we look at the experience that we've seen for the big three staples. Those lessons, I think, are enormously important as we refocus our efforts towards the minor staples, millets, sorghums, in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to participate, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference.